All right, 12:33. It's time to make a start. I'm sure the latecomers can catch up. So welcome to another session of CarbonCurious. This one is titled, perhaps somewhat sort of vaguely and generally, how does our tech work? We've got a lot of tech. We're only talking about a tiny fraction of that tech today, but I have with me Hille, who's our head of engineering, and he is going to be running you through a bunch of specific processes that we use for assessing and sort of like refining our assessments of land right through to registration and recognition of carbon sequestration. As usual, any questions, if you've got them, put them in the Q&A section. We've had quite a lot of questions come in over the course of the last few days, so we may be struggling for time to get through them, but we will try to follow up on those that we don't get to. And before we get started on the bulk of the day's presentation, I just wanted to give a quick update on some of what the tech has enabled. So this is a view of New Zealand with those areas that we had assessed as of a month or so ago. The green areas is everything that we've assessed within the last 3 months, I think it is, roughly. And it's almost doubled versus what we had at the end of last year, taking us from 2 million to more than 4 million hectares, and actually it's probably close to 5 million now total assessed across the country. All of that assessment is happening at pretty high resolution at the level that we sort of see individual trees on individual farms and can identify them. So it's not at all something you want to be doing by hand. And so quite a bit of what Hannes is going to be taking us through today is how we actually achieve that at scale while preserving accuracy and sort of auditability and integrity of the results. In connection with this, with the sort of most recent ETS reporting cycle, we're now north of $35 million paid out to landholders restoring forest. We've analysed more than 5,000 farms, I think actually significantly more now, and we've got around 300 ETS registrations in connection with that. So without further ado, into the specifics of what we're talking about today. So basically I was going to say there's 5 steps. There's much more than 5 steps. Like there's a lot that we're not going to get in today, but the basic high level process of going through and assessing the carbon opportunity on your property. Speaking today primarily outside of your ETS eligibility, we won't be going into the ETS a lot. Like if you're looking at your non-ETS removals, so those carbon removals which are occurring but aren't credited in the ETS, you need to go through analysing what you've got, identifying the stuff that's within the ETS, Hannes will explain why shortly, identifying the areas that might be eligible to be in the ETS even though you haven't registered them yet, and then of the stuff that's not in the ETS, decide what other things you might want to do with it, and then once you're doing something, start monitoring them. That's the very high level picture. We've got half an hour of getting into some of the weeds. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Hannes, who'll take you through it.
Okay, awesome. Well, let's dive straight into it. So to show that as a block, there's kind of like 4 steps as well. The first step of kind of assessing any land area for some removals is to look for the total forest area. And this can be done either by hand or at CarbonCrop we do it mostly using AI powered tools. And I'll just show what these kind of flow looks like at an overall high level so you can get some context before we dive into the tech itself. So if you go next, then the total forest area, we first want to identify the total forest area. We want to find which part of those are already ETS registered to avoid double counting, which we'll go into a bit more about the double counting avoidance. And then that leaves us with a bunch of unregistered forest area. The next step after that is that the unregistered forest area splits into potentially ETS eligible forest area and unregistered forest. The potentially ETS eligible forest might not be want to be tracked for removals, it might want to be registered in the ETS step. And then next up, for your unregistered forest, there's still a decision to make of does the landowner want to register this forest and without the obligations behind it, and all those other forests. And that is that last step, that kind of unregistered forest carbon removals that are available removals to use against a net zero claim. So I will jump on and share my screen and we'll just do we'll show what this looks like inside the CarbonCrop platform. Fantastic. Okay, so I've got this demo site here, and this isn't necessarily a CarbonCrop customer. It's just a little area of land that we found that is a fantastic example for us to use for showing forest cover and carbon removals. And we're going to start with the complete blank slate here and assess the carbon removals of the site as a demo. We'll quickly get a look for what's actually kind of going on here. So I've got a little farmhouse in here. We've got some paddocks here that are to be used for crops. We've got some pasture here. If you zoom in far enough, you can see some sheep running around it. So it is probably a lamb or a wool station. A lot of the farms that we assess are quite mixed use as well. And the thing that we're trying to assess here is the carbon removals of the forest here. So that can be used potentially for a net zero claim for some of the lamb or wool that is exported here. And if we look over the top here, we've got two big blocks of exotic forestry here. We've got a little island of native, remember that one, that'll show up later on. And we have some indigenous forest regeneration happening over the bottom here of mixed ages. We've got some mature stuff happening here, and we've got some regeneration happening over here as it kind of comes up the hill. So traditionally, one would map this by hand, and we do have a few hand mapping tools. You start going in, use the new polygon tool, and start kind of drawing polygons around the whole thing. However, we also have built some AI-powered tools that reduces the time it takes to do this kind of thing. So under our layers tab, we have, I'll just quickly click through this, the tool to produce polygons, and that takes a pre-run AI analysis and turns all of the forests on the land into these big polygons here, and are split by species as well. So we can see these two big exotic blocks appear, and we have this native forest here that's all grouped together, as well as a few sections over here and some smaller tendrils coming down this way. So what I want to do is, because I'm trying to get an overall picture for the carbon on the land, I'm going to set these all to a category of native carbon crop units, and that allows the system to pick them up and assess them according to our methodology. And then when I go to our forecasts tab, I can click on this button here to calculate the carbon on that land. Now, for a project about this size here, it's close to 1,000 hectares. It'll take a few hours to run. So I've pre-run this already, and I'm going to show you what the results of this might look like. I'll open this up here. We see the same farm again. This is kind of almost like an X-ray vision of the carbon on the land here. This is the carbon sequestration, and this is the carbon stock on the land. And jumping between the two, we see a few interesting things. We see the exotic blocks here showing up very brightly. Note that these wouldn't be eligible for native carbon crop units. Carbon crop units are only issued for native forests. Down here, we can see the native forest all showing up reasonably high in carbon sequestration. Over here, these kind of bright green areas are interesting. We can see that they're quite high in carbon stock, as shown by the quite bright green at about 500 tons per hectare, but they're quite low in carbon sequestration. You can see that almost this deep purple color. These areas here correspond to the already mostly established indigenous forest. The research here is a bit thin on what actually happens to native forests after about 100 to 200 years. However, CarbonCrop takes a reasonably conservative approach in that if we see forest that is reasonably old and well established, we assume that there is not much carbon sequestration happening there, or that the trees falling down and new trees growing up leads us a kind of steady state forest. So we avoid issuing carbon credits for that. So that is the first step. That's the analyze forest step done. Next up is the importing of existing.
Hannes, if you just go back to, I think you mentioned earlier on the that little pocket of native forest up the top, and here you can see, I think, quite clearly that even at there was a very small area, very little bit of native under the ETS rules. You'd just bundle that in and say it's part of your exotic forest. You don't need to map it separately, but yeah, just highlighting that where the cursor is there, it has been separately identified and correctly separately classified. And if you jump to the, oh yeah, it's got its own separate sequestration rate. Surprised that it doesn't show as having a different stock, or possibly it's just not visible because it blurs together. But yeah, it's very clearly being identified as a separate area of forest which is being separately accounted for and tracked and has different characteristics. I mean, that happens at high resolution across the whole property.
That's right. So that is under this little area here. And in fact, if we took this whole area and registered it for native carbon crop units, then our system would automatically only pick up the sequestration from this and issue carbon removals for that little patch. So probably in this case, we'd recommend registering some of this for the ETS if it was eligible for it.
Yep.
So we also output exotic. So those are three categories I showed before. The exotic forest shows up here. We have native steady state, where we see these forests down here. It's native forest that we believe is no longer sequestering carbon, and all of the native forest that is still sequestering carbon. Okay, on to step 2, which is the removing of, detecting the existing ETS areas. Nick, I'll let you talk a bit about why we would want to exclude ETS areas from carbon crop units.
Yeah, sure. It's actually there's the default position that everybody takes is that you don't want double recognition, you don't want double counting. These are bad things, and certainly philosophically we agree with that. We go to a huge amount of effort to avoid any instances of double recognition or double allocation or double counting. The sort of conservative position in that regard is that if you have some forest and it's registered in the ETS, then you are being already recognized within one accounting and carbon incentive program framework. And so you should not register it under any other framework, such as a voluntary recognition framework. That's the position we take. It's a position that's encouraged by most of the sort of general guidelines and methodologies in this space. There are some inconsistencies in it, though, which you'll find if you ever apply for a sort of an emissions assessment for your business activities, where let's say that you're operating a farm and you have vehicles on your farm and those vehicles use petrol. The emissions of that petrol will definitely be counted as an emission on your sort of voluntary emissions footprint. But you won't be allowed to count the removals associated with any forest on your property if it's registered in the ETS, which might seem like it makes sense superficially, except all of the petrol that you're using on your farm is also registered in the ETS and is being taxed under the ETS. So there's a bit of a weird situation where you have to pay twice, but you can only recognize your forest once. We have asked various sort of those in regulator roles within the space for a ruling on this perspective, and whether, let's say, you met your ETS obligations using native forest ETS credits, would that change your position? Nothing definitive has come back. So at this stage, we still take the same conservative approach as everybody else, which is before recognizing your native forest carbon removals for voluntary purposes, we identify anything that you have registered in the ETS and exclude it. So you can't get recognized twice. But it's going to be very interesting how this develops over time as the regulatory frameworks mature and things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms and the distinctions between international trade under voluntary frameworks versus treaty frameworks kind of all gets reconciled and worked out. It could be that actually they kind of merge together. But for now, you've got to count them, you've got to track them separately, and you've got to make it very clear to anybody who's auditing you that they are separate and that you do know where everything is and that you haven't allocated anything twice.
Cool, thanks, Nick. So to avoid double counting within the CarbonCrop platform, we do support importing from the emissions trading schemes, the CCIS format and the new 2PRK format of registered areas. So I know that these two areas here are registered, so I'm going to delete them as an existing forest. And I've got here a shapefile of the registered areas. We have a upload functionality. We can upload all sorts of things, including these eligible areas. If I pull that file and I drag and drop it into here, it will upload those registered areas, process them into a format that our system can understand, and then place them here on the map as registered areas. So we see they show up here as these two orange areas, which is our color coding for exotic forest that is registered in ETS. And this avoids us creating any additional polygons on that area. So if I try to now create extra forest here, then I try to make that like a native CarbonCrop unit, you can see that it cut it across to that boundary here to avoid this kind of double counting. A cool thing about this, if we're looking at the ETS side, is that we can now see we also pull in the attributes between the forest type and the establishment year. And in our forecast tab, we can see the forecasted values for this the kind of projected return for these two areas. We can also generate this registered areas report, which is like a very landowner focused report that tells you where the areas of forest are on your land that are registered in the ETS, the area of them, how many NZUs you're going to earn, in this case 7,000 NZUs this year, and it gives you a forecast for the next 10 years, as well as a graph, the same graph that we kind of saw before, showing you a bit about your registered areas. So that's a fun little side that we can generate as well as soon as the registered area is uploaded. But the primary reason, kind of for the purpose of this presentation here, is identifying these ETS eligible areas, ETS registered areas, so that they are not counted as part of any removal. Okay, next up, we have ETS eligible areas. So that's adding the registered areas. For the rest of the forest, not all of them might want to be reused for removals. Some of them might be eligible for the emissions trading scheme and might want to be registered as such. And we've done very close to 6,000 of these analyses now for landowners, so we get quite good at it. And the tools we use are here in this platform. The ETS has a variety of different rules for what forest can and can't go on the ETS. For example, the forest has to be greater than a hectare. And the key one, though, is the forest that was existing before 1990 cannot be registered under ETS in most cases. I'm going to do a quick demo of what that mapping here looks like and do like a really rough mapping of this polygon up in the top left corner here. And going to go back through this in the 1990 imagery. Here I've got the 1990 state. I'm going to use this one from 1987, which is a bit better resolution. And we see here that there is some forest that was already existing around about that time. So if we want to register or potentially register this polygon, the ETS, that has to be cut out. And we can use our split tool to split this polygon out. I'm just going to do a really rough job here for the purposes of demo. Split out some of these rough pre-90 forestry areas here. We'll lop off that whole peninsula over the top there and remove it on the side. Now, I could keep going with this and do a full assessment. There's polygons over here. There's a bit of post-89 stuff there as well. But I'm just going to keep to these ones at the moment here. Now we can select these polygons here, that one and that one. And I'm going to set them to ETS forest. And for the ETS, we need to set the species. This one is indigenous forest. And we used to give it an establishment year. Establishment year is a bit involved, but I'm going to do just a really quick rough guess here. I see that in 1998, it's still no forest. Go to 2006. You can see there's some forest there. So I'm going to really roughly guess an establishment year of 1997, just for the purpose of the demo here. Once we set all of those details, we can again look at our forecasts and see the potential forecast for this particular area. And from this, make an assessment together with the landowner if it's worth registering this forest in the emissions trading scheme or not. So there's a bit of a conversation about how much money it's going to earn and the cost of creating ETS registration obligations under that. Okay, so to stock take what I've done here. We started with a blank slate. We identified all of the forests on the land using AI. We imported the ETS registered areas. We've identified a few potentially eligible areas that we might want to additionally register in the ETS. And lastly, is we might want to use some of this existing forest here that we don't want to register in the ETS or is eligible for the ETS as part of a carbon removal program. For this, we would similarly use the tools to decide which forest to go in. So let's say that the landowner had agreed to preserve this area over here. We might split that forest into two, like this here, and then decide to continue with this registration of this. For forests that we don't want to include, we could either just delete it directly off our map so that we don't see it, or I'm just going to undo that and redo to keep that split in there. And the alternative is that we can take the forest areas and uninclude them, which keeps them on the map, but says that we don't want to include these areas in any kind of carbon removal program at the moment. And once we've once there's an agreed upon forest area, then they can be registered with CarbonCrop or any other carbon removal program as well. Like CarbonCrop is not the only voluntary scheme out there. Once registered there with CarbonCrop, we will every year generate CarbonCrop units, where one unit is equivalent to 1 ton of carbon allocated to a net zero program. Okay, so that was the overall kind of demo of our platform. I want to talk a little bit about the integrity and traceability of an area of forest once it is registered. So let's say that we've gone through all these steps and this had been registered with a landowner and they were earning units. What ongoing obligations are there, and what does CarbonCrop do to make sure that the units issued and the removals assessed here kind of keep the integrity going? So we have three main tools that we use here to kind of preserve integrity. The first one is forest loss detection. So this is a different property here that we ran forest loss detection on earlier this year. And we see here that there is a bit of bunch of exotic forest, and all of the orange areas here were areas that our system automatically detected as being forest loss. In this case, we know that was a harvesting situation. This was commercial forestry that was, the forest there was logged. And note that it wasn't actually visible on aerial imagery because aerial imagery only went up to 2021. Our system uses Sentinel-2 satellite constellation by ESA to monitor for forest changes, and we can see forest changes as recently as 2 months ago. So we continually monitor forests for forest loss to make sure that any units issued correspond to trees that are still in the ground. After that,
I wonder if it's just worth briefly mentioning, Hannes, for there may be a mix of people on the call, but when you make a claim around carbon neutralization using carbon that's been removed from the atmosphere and stored in a tree, it's connected to an assumption around it staying stored in that tree. So like let's say you burn, I don't know what the exact numbers are, I think it's on the order of 200 litres of petrol. That creates 1 tonne of CO2 emissions, and it's going to stay in the atmosphere for quite a long time. There's no easy way to suck it out. The short of trees, which are very good at it. So if you want to say that you've neutralized those emissions so that the net change in atmospheric CO2 because of you burning that ton of, 200 kilos of petrol is 0, then you have to find something that's pulled the equivalent of 200 kilos of burning petrol, so 1 tonne of CO2 out of the atmosphere and locked it up. And once you've done that, it has to stay locked up for a very long time. Like if the tree pulls it out of the atmosphere and then you kind of take some money from somebody for neutralizing their emissions, and then 2 years later you cut the tree down, or even it falls down, or any manner of things happen which result in what's termed a reversal event, so the sequestration is reversed, then you haven't neutralized the emissions over the time frame that matters. And that's why these ongoing monitoring tools are extremely important. Like if you want to be able to make a claim to having neutralized your emissions with integrity, you have to be able to demonstrate that the trees that you're using did sequester that amount of carbon and that they're still there and that they're going to remain there for a significant period of time into the future. We use 100 years as the period for which the landholder has an obligation to maintain the sequestration. And you're not going to do that by hand. Nobody's going to bother checking. You have to have an automated framework that's going to continue reviewing it for you and making sure that the claims that you've made can be substantiated.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks.
It's also, since I'm not sure you're going to come back to it, Hannes, there's obligations under the emissions trading scheme for deforestation detection as well. That's actually how we developed the tool and the primary purpose it's been used for. And so we've done hundreds of properties through multiple emissions return cycles. Every single one of them has this process run across the entire thing. It's saved us a lot of times from making mistakes and our landholders from making a lot of mistakes. And that's why we're quite confident applying it for this purpose as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so we think this is great for the landowner because it eases the reporting of forest loss since we would detect it up front. And it's also great for like CarbonCrop managing the emissions trading scheme and make sure that we remain compliant. And it's great for anyone running a carbon removals program as well because you don't have to rely on the landowner telling you if something happens. On that note, if we do have to have the landowner telling us something happens, we have developed an app called FieldScan. It's available on the App Store and it allows landowners to take evidence photos of their land. We've primarily used it for new planting schemes under the emissions trading scheme, but we think it's like valuable overall. There's a lot of landowners there doing fantastic work and fantastic work doing really good planting programs, and we want to make sure they get recognized for it. And them being able to upload evidence or take photos on their land that are geotagged and timestamped and audited makes really gives a whole lot of integrity to the system.
It's also a really great tool for cost-effective program management because, like, often a huge amount of collecting evidence or updating information or any of these things for various scales of program, it's not about what you do once you're at the site. It's about getting to the site to actually take the action and collect the evidence. Whereas if you've got someone who's already there as a part of their natural day-to-day tasks, being the landholder or the farm manager or whoever, you can massively improve the economics of the scheme. And at the same time, we've actually found it has a big impact in kind of positive engagement with a restoration program. If your restoration program is just something that somebody else does and that's on your property and you're not really involved, then you tend not to be as committed to the outcomes. Whereas if you're involved even in just evidence collection, let alone the pest control or the planting or the stock exclusion or whatever, then it's much more of a kind of your project rather than their project, and it improves the project outcome, basically.
Well, thanks. And lastly, I wanted to talk a bit about Carbon Tracer. Talking about the double counting avoidance things from beforehand, there unfortunately isn't a worldwide place where you can go to see what areas of forest have been registered for voluntary carbon. And we really wish there was. It would be fantastic. But we've at least tried to make our own start and make it really easy to see for all of CarbonCrop's units that were issued where they are and what forest is on. So when we issue a bunch of CarbonCrop units, it looks something like this. So here's like a kind of demo spreadsheet. Each token, each row here, it represents one carbon unit and it represents 1 ton of carbon sequestered. We track which year it was sequestered in, the location that it was sequestered and when we kind of issued it. And each individual token gets a link to CC Trace. And this is publicly available, and this shows exactly where that token or where that ton of carbon was generated and which forest that kind of came from here. And this always shows the most up-to-date imagery, so users or people referencing this CCU, this CarbonCrop unit, can track back that the forest is still there and does still exist. Is there more you wanted to talk to about that, Nick?
No, I think you covered it beautifully. I'd just note that Excel spreadsheet that you just saw, that is not our registry. That is an export from our registry that we sometimes use for data sharing with people who want to have their own copy of the records. But there's a database behind us that stores the history of all of the allocations, who the units have been allocated to after they've been initially created, which is again very important for like when people talk about double counting, there's a couple of different forms of double counting. One of them is that you issue units multiple times for the same area of forest, whether within the same program or across multiple programs. Having audit tools like this that you can at least publicly show what you have registered and where is a critical part of at least being able to detect that. But another very important part is double allocation. So like once you've got a unit for an area of forest and it's been legitimately recognized under a single program, because it's such an ephemeral thing, if you don't have particular controls to prevent this, it would be quite easy for someone either accidentally or nefariously to sell that same unit of carbon to 1 or 2 or 37 different people, and they all think they've got a tree, but actually only one of them has a tree and the rest of them have like some made-up fairy dust. Because of the way our registry works, you actually, when you make a claim in connection with a carbon unit, you have to allocate it to a program, and then only that program will retain ownership of it, which will be part of what's available in Carbon Tracer in the future, that you can see not only where the unit is, but also whose the unit is and what they're using it for.